There's lots of different kinds of long-term care. There's in-home care, there's assisted living, there's nursing homes, there's memory care facilities, hospice care can be considered a form of long-term care, and more. So there's a lot of different things that can be considered long-term care. And I've got some statistics that I thought were interesting to include today, and these are from various sources. Today's 65-year-olds have nearly 70% chance of requiring long-term care services or support during their remaining years. So 70% of 65-year-olds would potentially need long-term care down the road. Among the 65-year-olds, 1/3 may never require long-term care, while 20% will require it for more than 5 years.
You are listening to the Legacy Talk podcast hosted by James A. Jones,
attorney at law and founder of Sound Legacy Law, PLLC in Tacoma.
Attorney Jones is here to talk about how to best protect your family, assets, and wealth, pulling stories from his more than 20 years of helping families and business owners protect their assets, create their estate plans, preserve their wealth, and plan for the future. Nobody wants to think about estate planning, but life has a way of sneaking up on you, and at any moment, something unexpected could happen that will leave you regretting not having acted sooner. So join Attorney James A. Jones in the Legacy Talk podcast, and together learn how to plan for your future today and have peace of mind tomorrow.
Welcome to Legacy Talk. I'm your host, James Jones. I'm an estate planning and probate attorney in Tacoma, Washington. I've been practicing for over 20 years, and my main practice areas include estate planning, probate, and estate administration. On Legacy Talk, we're discussing topics surrounding families and estates. Estate planning is often a confusing and complicated topic, but my goal with this podcast is to make it accessible and understandable to those who need it. So if this is something that interests you, I'd appreciate it if you click the subscribe button and like this episode so that you can follow along as we break down the barriers to estate planning. I'm excited to get to today's episode, as always. Today's topic is elder law and estate planning, protecting your assets from long-term care costs. Because you and your loved ones may need long-term care someday, and proactive planning is critical. So on today's show, we're talking about elder law and estate planning, protecting your assets from long-term care costs. So let's get to it. Sometimes dying is easier than living. That may seem fatalistic, but it's often true in the case of long-term care. And it's sad to say, but it is. When we talk about long-term care, we're talking about services and support for those who need it and need assistance with their daily living activities due to chronic illness, disabilities, and cognitive impairments. The purpose of long-term care is to help maintain that independence for people and the quality of life when they can't perform those essential tasks on their own. And there's lots of different kinds of long-term care. There's in-home care, there's assisted living, there's nursing homes, there's memory care facilities, hospice care can be considered a form of long-term care, and more. So there's a lot of different things that can be considered long-term care. And I've got some statistics that I thought were interesting to include today, and these are from various sources. Today's 65-year-olds have nearly 70% chance of requiring long-term care services or support during their remaining years. So 70% of 65-year-olds would potentially need long-term care down the road. Among the 65-year-olds, 1/3 may never require long-term care, while 20% will require it for more than 5 years. Regardless of lifetime earnings, it's expected that more than 50% of those over 65 will require significant funded long-term care support. That means helping pay for it, right? And this is from 2022 statistic. Medicaid spent in 2022 $154 billion on long-term care services. And according to the American Association for Long-Term Care Insurance, long-term care insurance firms paid out a record $13.25 billion in 2022, which must be the last year that they have stats for. Finally, 45% of residents in assisted living facilities utilize Medicaid to pay for their care costs. So 45% don't have enough money, basically is what that means. Don't have enough money to pay for it themselves. And so they have Medicaid help. So chances are, based on those statistics, that you or someone in your family will need long-term care at some point in your lifetime, right? And planning for that scenario, therefore, becomes essential and critical to your estate plan and retirement plan. So the main section of this episode, we're going to talk about strategies, okay? We want to talk about understanding long-term care a little bit, okay? So on average, nursing home care costs about $10,000 a month, okay? That's over $100,000 a year on average. Assisted living and home care also present significant hardships and challenges financially. So in-home care is not cheap. Living in an assisted living, which is a level down from nursing home care, is not cheap, but it's cheaper than $10,000 plus a month, but it's still not cheap, right? And without proper planning, those types of expenses can really impact your retirement savings. And in most cases, people run out of money. And this care is not necessarily short. Depending on what your disability is, it could be a few months, it could be many years, right? And most people underestimate how long this might last, right? The average length of a stay in a nursing home is 2 to 3 years, but some people stay much longer. Typically when people have like dementia and they might be perfectly healthy, but their brains just aren't working anymore due to the dementia, they might live in the facility for 10 years, right? And so that's expensive. And that impact, the financial impact, is often borne by the family members. And so failure to plan puts a significant burden on family members to sort of make sure that there's enough money to cover mom or dad in a facility, which is tough, right? It's tough. So what can we do to plan? So there's things you can do to plan for this. It's not, well, what am I supposed to do about this? Like, I don't know if my mom or dad is going to have long-term care needs. I don't know if I'll need long-term care down the road. But there are things to do to be proactive about this. And so I'm going to be talking about some of these issues here and some of these options potentially in this episode. So first thing to talk about is planning for Medicaid, okay? And there's different types of Medicaid planning, but in this episode we're talking about long-term Medicaid planning. We're not talking about crisis Medicaid planning necessarily, which means mom or dad needs care yesterday and we don't have enough money for it, but we have too much money to qualify for Medicaid, okay? So we're not talking about crisis planning today, but we're going to be talking about long-term planning. Okay. And so let's talk a little bit about Medicaid. So Medicaid simply is basically a health insurance program for people that don't have enough money to pay for health insurance themselves, right? And so Medicaid in long-term care setting covers long-term care services. So they'll cover you to stay or someone to stay in a long-term care facility like a nursing home or assisted living center or adult family home, or they'll even pay for in-home care in certain situations. And most states allow, including Washington, an individual to have a whopping $2,000 of assets and still qualify. So if you've got less than $2,000, you're slam dunk in there on Medicaid. Problem is, most everybody that's thinking about Medicaid for long-term care has enough retirement savings saved up because they're living off their money, right? Most of them have a house, some of them have 2 houses. So that leads us to the importance of having your assets structured in such a way so that you can qualify for Medicaid if the time or need arises, okay? So Medicaid planning involves structuring assets to meet eligibility requirements while preserving wealth and legacy for heirs, okay? This sometimes involves retitling assets, setting up trusts, strategic spending on things that are allowable things to spend on, like home improvements or clothing or travel, things like that. And so you're allowed to plan for Medicaid, I guess is what I'm getting to. You can have $2,000 in assets if you're a single person to qualify for Medicaid, but you can plan for it, right? The rule that they put against you for planning purposes is that any planning that's done, which means you could gift assets away and qualify for Medicaid, right? But the rule is anything within a 5-year window would be something that they could see. So there's a 5-year look-back period for gifts. Medicaid looks at financial transactions made within 5 years before applying for services. And transfers or gifts during that period of time can result in penalties and delay eligibility. So if you said, okay, well, I've got to get mom into care and mom has a rental house and she's got money in the bank and she's got a stock portfolio, doesn't matter what numbers we're talking about here, really. If we transfer it within 2 years and she needs Medicaid in 2 years, she's not going to qualify because that transfer, the house transfer and the portfolio transfer, the money transfer and the rental house transfer, will all disqualify her for up to 5 years, okay? And so we want to make sure that those gifting plans are done strategically and that there's enough time, okay? So one way to make these gifts, right, one structure to use for making these Medicaid planning transactions is an irrevocable trust, okay? Sometimes they're called Medicaid Asset Protection Trusts. I call them irrevocable trusts, okay? And these irrevocable trusts are used to protect assets from being included in that look into your financial situation for Medicaid purposes, okay? So assets placed into an irrevocable trust are not counted toward Medicaid eligibility as long as the transfer is before 5 years or after 5 years, right? So 5 years and a day after you make the transfer, you could potentially be eligible for Medicaid if assets are put into the trust and the trust is structured properly and managed properly. The benefit of this is that your assets are placed into a trust that's protected, from creditors. It's protected by the virtue of the agreement from being mismanaged, hopefully. And it can preserve wealth for heirs. It can avoid probate, and it can make sure that you can get on Medicaid, okay? The downside of these trusts is that the transfer into the trust is permanent. Once you put money into an irrevocable trust, you can't take it back out pursuant to the terms of the trust. The trust says once it's there, it's there. And the only person that can take it out of there is the trustee. And the trustee can only take it out of there in certain situations that are called for in the trust agreement. And so if you're a younger person or even someone that's like 60 years old or early retired, right, and your brain still works, you're probably not going to want to put all of your assets in an irrevocable trust at that point. And so usually these irrevocable trusts aren't done too far in the future in order to get someone approved, just because the hassle of giving all your stuff away and basically having no right to it legally. So that's a negative, right? It solves the problem as long as you have 5 years to play around with it, but it does have some negatives, okay? Another way to pay for long-term care is to have long-term care insurance. And long-term care insurance is insurance that you buy that covers long-term care. And so this covers oftentimes, there's different kinds of policies. There's some that only cover in-home care. There's some that only cover like institutional care. Some that cover both. Most probably cover both. Okay. But the problem is these premiums in these long-term care policies are expensive, and the rates go up as you age and based on health conditions and age when you buy the policy. And you can buy policies with different coverage amounts, different benefit periods, ineligibility or elimination periods. Like we're going to wait, it'll be a 30-day elimination or a 60-day elimination or 90-day before the policy kicks in after you've been into a facility. The pro of the long-term care policy is that it protects assets because you can preserve assets because you have insurance helping pay, and give you more options as far as paying for care, which means you have more options as to what kind of care you get. It means you can have in-home care if you may not have been able to afford it otherwise, right? And it also helps preserve family wealth, of course. The cons are the high premiums, that it's going to potentially go up in price, right? Premiums increase over time. And if you effectively plan for Medicaid, you wouldn't necessarily need it. And if you did need it then, or did get on Medicaid, then that policy would still cover, but Medicaid wouldn't be paying as much. So you really didn't need it at that point. There are some policies in place that have sort of a hybrid effect where there's life insurance component and a long-term care component. Those are more popular these days. A negative, though, in the state of Washington is a few years ago, Washington implemented a state long-term care tax, basically, that made it so you can either get long-term care insurance to not have to pay this withholding tax, or pay this tax, which pays a percentage of your income. I don't even know what it's not a huge percentage, but it's a percentage of your income to the state of Washington to pay for this care down the road, potentially, which is a very small number. It's like $30-something thousand, which is about 3 months worth of care if we're talking $10,000 a month. So it's very low. So what happened because of that law is everybody went and tried to get long-term care policies in Washington. And what it did to the long-term care industry here is it required, or basically forced, a ton of different long-term care insurance companies to leave the state and say, well, we can't sell policies there because there's just too many people that want them, and we're not going to be able to pay all these policies if that's the case. So they didn't have enough policies for the people that were looking for them. So they left, right? And so the long-term care options in Washington are limited. They're more limited than in other states, as far as I know, due to that state long-term care tax, which isn't great. Another thing to consider in your long-term care planning, and we talk about this on almost every episode of Legacy Talk, is durable power of attorney. You want to have for your parents and for yourself a durable power of attorney for finance and a durable power of attorney for healthcare. Sometimes it's the same document, sometimes it's separate documents, where you appoint an agent to help manage financial affairs, make decisions with regard to your assets, and Medicaid planning. And you can also name someone to make healthcare decisions, deal with your doctors, long-term care decisions, right? With regard to what facility you go to and what healthcare professionals could do for you. And then the thing that you want to consider, though, is a durable power of attorney in Washington has to specifically mention certain things that it does, okay? So if you want your power of attorney to be able to do financial transactions, you may need to make sure that the kind of transactions that you want it to make, or that person to make, are listed. Like, I want them to be able to make gifts to qualify for me for Medicaid if necessary. So they need to explicitly provide that, hey, you can do planning for me if I can't. And you want to make sure that these goals and these powers that are given in the durable power of attorney align with your other estate planning. Okay, so you don't want to go, basically bottom line is, you don't want to go get a durable power of attorney off, right, just from the internet, or buy a kit at an office supply store or whatever. You want to go to an attorney, an estate planning attorney that knows how to draft a durable power of attorney in Washington that can talk about these contingencies, okay? And the reason why is because here's the hedge, right? If you're 65 and you don't think you need long-term care for another 10 years or 15 years, you're probably not going to gift all of your assets into an irrevocable trust. It doesn't make a lot of sense because you're giving up control. You're still in the prime of life, usually. And so in many cases, those people will do a revocable trust and set up a plan with durable power of attorney, healthcare directives, wills, and all that stuff. And the durable power of attorney that we draft allows, if something happens, if things change, right, and that person can't make a decision or can't sign any documents anymore, the durable power of attorney allows them to make those decisions, right? Help with gifting, create a trust, all those kinds of things to sort of pivot from this revocable trust plan, which is a prime of life plan, which most people benefit from, to an irrevocable trust plan, which is more of a Medicaid long-term care plan. And so even though you're not thinking, well, hey, I got to get my long-term care planning done, you need to consider your estate planning in such a way that if you ever do need long-term care down the road, your estate plan as it sits allows for the pivot or the transition to a long-term care plan. So let's talk about gifting in this 5-year look-back period. 5-year look-back period is this, basically. Any gifts or transfers of assets within 5 years of applying for Medicaid can result in penalties, okay? And the penalties, so the way this works is, if you've made a gift within, say you made a gift 4 years before you apply for Medicaid, they ask you, have you made any gifts within the last 5 years? If you've made it within 4, you say yes. And the problem is that it doesn't retroactively say, well, it's been 4 years, so we really only need to count a year of ineligibility. All the gift comes back, right? And so they calculate ineligibility based on the amount of the gift divided by the daily rate of care. And so, or the average monthly cost, which is basically broken down to the daily rate, which tells you how many days ineligible you'd be. So if you made a huge gift and then you applied too early, you could completely lose out on being eligible for Medicaid. And so you want to make sure timing is done right. And early planning is critical because the 5-year look-back period. So if you're thinking you might need long-term care, or your kids might be at this point, you start thinking about it right away. As soon as that happens, you start thinking about it, you start working about it, you work with an attorney to get that done. And these kinds of gifts can be made into trust. They can be directly to kids. They can be charitable gifts, but they need to be made with this careful timing and consideration of that Medicaid requiring window, okay? And then another thing to consider too, if you're gifting, watch out for titling. Like, make sure mom's not a joint owner on any of your accounts if you're doing things for it. That's money from your paycheck or something, or money that you save. Don't have mom on those accounts. And don't be on mom's account as a joint owner if you can help it, because that can cause problems, which I'll mention later in the story section of this episode. One thing that you can keep with Medicaid is a house, okay? You're allowed to have a house, a primary residence, and qualify for Medicaid based on the equity limits. So if your equity is too much, you wouldn't be able to have it done. But that's assuming your equity is not massive. You'd probably qualify to keep your house for Medicaid. Okay. The trade-off, though, is that after you've received services and payments for Medicaid, then DSHS can come back, which is the Department of Health and Human Services here, Social and Health Services in Washington, can come back and put a lien on your house, seek reimbursement from the house for what they've paid on your behalf, okay? And so you want to consider options for transferring the house. Like, if it's a married couple, you can transfer your house to your well spouse without any penalties. Any transfers to spouses are penalty-free, though in Washington it's a community property state, and so all the community assets or the assets of the spouse count toward the other assets of the spouse trying to apply. You can also transfer in certain instances to minor or disabled children that live with you. And there's other transfers that you can make to an in-home caregiver that's been a child, right? A member of your family. But they have to live there for a certain period of time, and there's time limits on that. You can also put that house in an irrevocable trust if you're gifting all of your assets. That's another option, back to the irrevocable trust. And then the other option would be to sell the thing, right? But oftentimes if you sold the house, then you've got a whole bunch of money sitting in your account, and then you're definitely ineligible. So you selling the house sometimes doesn't make sense because you don't want that extra money in your account. Okay. So what happens if you're a married couple and your spouse needs to go into long-term care, but you don't? Okay. And so Medicaid allows for something called a community spouse resource allowance. If the community spouse lives at home, they can retain a portion of the couple's assets. It's around $150,000, $160,000 of non-exempt assets known as the community spouse resource allowance, so that they have something, right? And they can keep the house, and hopefully if you're a married couple, we typically put the house in the spouse's name so there's no lien issue. And then the other thing is, what happens to my spouse's income if they go into long-term care and I'm stuck here? Medicaid is a participatory program, so that means that if they're paying, say the bill's $6,000 a month, the Medicaid rate is $6,000 or something, and Medicaid says, well, you make $2,000, so we'll pitch in the other $4,000. Okay, so you pitch in your income and they pitch in the rest. Okay. And so if you're married, it's potentially possible that all of your income could go toward that Medicaid bill. But if you don't make enough money, depending on what your income is, depending on income size, the community spouse can keep a portion of that, the income of the Medicaid spouse, so that they can maintain their standard of living. And the well spouse also keeps their own income. So, and another option too for a married couple is to do a spousal annuity, Medicaid qualified annuity. I'm not going to get into the details on those, but there's potential there to shelter assets too in a spousal Medicaid qualified annuity. Another thing to consider for long-term care planning is veterans benefits. So if you served during wartime or have a family member that served during certain war times, may qualify for something called aid and attendance, which is sort of like a pension that you can get depending on your situation. And there's the eligibility requirements require that you serve during certain active war times, and you have to meet income and asset limits just like Medicaid. It's very similar qualification. You have to be a veteran, of course, too. And so oftentimes combining those resources can help fund the care without having to spend every last cent down in certain cases. And so that's an option too. Okay. And finally, with any plan, you want to make sure that your plan is still good, that it's doing what it's supposed to do by reviewing it regularly, right? And so we want to make sure that we're changing these plans if necessary. If rules change, if laws change, if your personal situation changes, because you're basically putting, if you're doing an irrevocable trust style plan or durable power of attorney or both, you're putting a lot of trust into somebody that's often your kid or a friend or a brother or sister or whatever, right? That's managing all of your stuff. And so you want to make sure that's right and that they stay up on it. You want to keep reviewing things, make sure that they're still up to date, specifically like a durable power of attorney. If laws change, you want to make sure that the power of attorney still has the same teeth and effect as it had before. And you want to work with an attorney, right? You want to work with an attorney on this. This is not something that you want to do yourself through LegalZoom or any of those types of websites. That's not something that they typically do, I don't think. You want to work with someone that has experience because the law changes so much and things change so much. And if you don't phrase certain things right, that could be a negative when you're applying for Medicaid. So there's lots of things to consider, and having competent counsel on your side is important to that. So that brings us to the story time for this episode. So I've got 3 little stories, okay? First one is about a man who was in his 80s, and he had pretty good assets. He had a large house, or a very expensive house in Seattle, and he had 2 other pieces of property. So he had too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but we thought and he also had cash, right? He had some cash. So what we did is we did an irrevocable trust plan, and we put all the properties in the irrevocable trust, and that gave him quite a bit of money, and he sold one of the properties. That gave him quite a bit of money to deal with his long-term care costs, and he didn't end up having to need Medicaid. And I'm going to back up too. When you go into a long-term care facility, and this ties into this plan too, and help maybe why this works for this client, is typically when you go into a long-term care facility, typically nice ones, one that you want mom to go into or dad, not a junky dump, okay? Those types of facilities want you to pay privately 1 to 2 to 3 years before they'll allow you to convert into a Medicaid patient, okay? And so you're going to want to have some money to pay for that because there's very few options for you if you don't have any money to pay for care privately, because Medicaid oftentimes doesn't kick in right away. And more often than not, the facilities that take Medicaid want you to pay privately for a while because the private rates are higher than Medicaid rates. And so they want to be able to get some revenue before they start getting the reduced rate that they get from the government. Okay. And so in that case that I was just mentioning, the guy with the 3 properties, and they sold the big house in Seattle, and so there's a bunch of money left. They were in a really nice facility, and they had to pay privately for 3 years before they would convert to Medicaid. And so what happened in that case is they didn't end up having to convert because he passed away. But the positive thing about that is that even though they did this trust plan, and it didn't necessarily have to be used for Medicaid because he died sooner than the trust would allow him to qualify, they avoided probate, which avoided a lot of time and expenses and hassle and all that stuff. And the man lived happy and healthy, even though his dementia was strong, to a long old age. Okay. And so that's one story. The other one is one where it does work, where I had a client do some planning for his uncle, and they created an irrevocable trust, and they had a property, and they had a bank account, and they put that property and bank account in this irrevocable trust. And it's been over 5 years since the trust was funded, and so they're working on the next phase of the plan. Uncle's still alive, and they're working on getting qualified for Medicaid. So because of that plan and allowing the, enough time to get everything in place and to wait that 5-year look back period, the uncle's going to be able to qualify for Medicaid through that plan. Okay, so that's a positive. Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that joint ownership issue. So if you have an account with mom, or if mom's on an account of yours and it's for some reason it was there for convenience, and maybe it was one you missed, when you're an adult, maybe it was an account when you were a kid or something. I don't know. If you're on an account with your parent and that account has their name on it, that's going to count against them for Medicaid purposes. And taking their name off can be considered a transfer. And so you really need to watch titling issues. We recently did a Medicaid plan for a woman who had a joint account with her grandson. I think it was for convenience sake, but because her name was on it, Medicaid wanted to count that as an asset of hers. And it wasn't a huge amount of assets, but it was enough assets that made it so that she didn't qualify right away. And we had to provide other paperwork and proof of where that money came from and all of that stuff. So really watch titling. So that brings us to the something good in the news segment. We're back having a something good segment this week. This is from NOLA.com. From New Orleans, okay? Roughly 4 months after NBA legend Charles Barkley promised $1 million to St. Mary's Academy in New Orleans East, the private school where 2 students cracked the centuries-old mathematical equation received its first $100,000 from Barkley, okay? The school will continue to receive donations for the next 10 years, they've said. These 2 students, Calcia Johnson and Nakia Jackson, have since graduated, but were featured on CBS 60 Minutes in May after solving the Pythagorean theorem, which is a common equation, but it's an equation that has stumped mathematicians for roughly 2,000 years. And this segment inspired Barkley to donate to the school. And a representative of Charles Barkley's foundation said that the former professional basketball player is focused on transforming future generations through educational opportunities. Barkley has a love and passion for what the Academy stands for, how it's shaping the lives and futures of young girls in New Orleans. Representative said. Pamela Rogers, president of St. Mary's Academy, said in the press release that the staff are forever grateful for the 10-year gift and Barkley's support for their students. This transformative gift will assist students as they excel and achieve whatever dream they create within the walls of St. Mary's Academy, she said. So here's what happened. During their senior year, Johnson and Jackson spent their winter break focused on this bonus question for a math contest in their class. The bonus question was far more difficult than what students typically see on tests or across the classroom whiteboard. In fact, it was deemed impossible to answer until Johnson and Jackson proved that wasn't the case. The pair obsessively worked for months and months to solve the theorem. For 2 months, we worked together nonstop during school, after school, at lunch, at home, Johnson told the Times-Picayune last year. With the use of trigonometry, because I was wondering, I'm pretty sure the Pythagorean theorem's been solved. But here's the twist, okay? With the use of trigonometry, Johnson and Jackson eventually solved the Pythagorean theorem, which is a Greek principle surrounding the relations between 3 sides of a right triangle. The mathematical puzzle has been proven in many other ways over thousands of years, but never with trigonometry. So that's it, right? So interesting. So these high school seniors figured this thing out. Charles Barkley saw it on 60 Minutes, and he said, well, I'm going to give them $1 million to that school, which is pretty cool. Charles Barkley is a pretty charitable guy. And that goes along with our legacy talk, right? We talk about charitable giving, we talk about legacy. And he's created this legacy for these students of this academy of $1 million gift over 10 years to support them. And that's part of his legacy, helping people with, or youth with educational support. So that's pretty awesome. Good job, Charles. So that's the end of our episode. I'd like to thank you for listening to today's episode of Legacy Talk. If you liked today's episode and would like to learn more, please like and subscribe for more great content. I've been your host, James Jones. To your legacy.
Thank you for listening to the Legacy Talk podcast by attorney James A. Jones. If you found today's episode helpful, we ask that you like and follow us on all major platforms so you don't miss out on the latest episode. If you have questions for Attorney Jones, reach out at info@joneslegacylaw.com or visit our website at joneslegacylaw.com. Join us again next week for another episode of the Legacy Talk podcast.